Hi everyone, welcome to my lecture on research instruments. I'm Dr. Presley Rankin here at City University of Seattle, and I'm going to go over some common research instruments used in both qualitative and quantitative work. So we'll start off with qualitative work, and the largest, most commonly used instrument in qualitative work is the interview. Now, interviews are a function of basically talking to someone. But the instrument part of it is the structure in which you have this conversation with someone. So it's your interview guide would technically be the instrument you are using. An interview or interviewing is what you do with that instrument. Using interviews as a data collection tool allows for a deeper dive into the information you want to gather. People typically are interviewed in everyday life, from job interviews or interviews for the news, those kind of things. But with research, the interview is more structured and more systematic. It's also important that you're interviewing for a reason. You're trying to answer your research questions with the data that you're going to collect from this interview. You're able, through interviews, to collect rich contextual descriptions of events or of the way people think or the something that has happened to them or their opinion about something that has happened to them. You not only are getting information from the actual interview questions, but you're also seeing the way that they talk, listening to their emotions, their feelings as they're expressing them through the interview. Interviews also allow you to ask follow-up questions and delve deeper when necessary. So the reason we interview is that it is the most obvious way to find information. Interviews have lots of advantages for the qualitative researcher. They allow for the collecting, like I said, of a deeper, personalized, rich data in order to then help you solve a problem from the point of view of the people experiencing that problem. You are, during that interview, allowed to request follow-ups, to probe deeper, to get more information. And sometimes your interviews will lead you in a different direction than you had originally thought, and that would inspire you to add more questions to your interview guide. Now, there are different types of interviews, and this is important to understand. The most often used type of interviewing is semi-structured interviews. In a semi-structured interview, you have a predetermined list of questions, but the order in which you ask the questions or the question's wording can be changed. If you, through your interviewing, realize that you need to add something to a question, you can add it to the question from that point going forward. You can also be able to not use a question if the participant already answered it in another way or in another question that you had asked. Then you don't need to ask them the question again if you already have the information that is needed. Now, a fully structured interview is predetermined question, fixed wording, set order. The idea here is that every person is asked the same set of questions and then therefore has a chance to give answers to that same set of questions in a similar way. Now, typically this type of fully structured interview tends to be part of a survey or questionnaire, and is really less interview based, because really the person is answering a specific question, and usually they do that in written form. So a fixed, fully structured interview will tend to be something that is emailed or something that is part of a questionnaire or survey. So you can, though, have a fully structured interview for qualitative research where you're actually interviewing participants. The only issue with it is that, like I said, with the semi-structured interview, you can make changes, which with a fully structured interview, you can't. Unstructured interviews are basically conversations where the researcher is having a conversation with the participant and wants it to be informal. They want to get as much information as possible about some general area of interest and concern, but they're less interested in answering specific research questions. Perhaps their research question is broader, or perhaps their research question is about a general level of interest and the conversation will help to develop. Conversations are also typically used, these unstructured interviews, when you're doing narrative research where you are actually asking a participant to tell you their story. You really don't have questions to give them. You're basically just asking them to tell you a story. And then as they tell the story, you may probe them to explain something or to go into a deeper detail about that thing. So unstructured interviews would be typical for the narrative type. Have some interviewing tips to give you here. It's important when you are doing an interview that you do the least amount of talking as possible. Number one, you don't want to bias the interviewee by giving them your opinions or your thoughts or anything like that. So you want to stay unbiased, and the best way to do that is by not sharing a lot about yourself. So you should listen more than you speak. The questions should be straightforward, clear, and non-threatening. And you also need to make sure that they are not biased or get people defensive or confused. You need to be very clear. You want to eliminate clues, and this is another part of bias. You want to make sure that you're not trying to get somebody to give you the correct response. Examples, are you against sin? Who's going to say, no, I love sin. Sin's the best. You're biasing them to answer the question the way you want them to. And then you really should have a good time. You want to make sure that the person you're interviewing doesn't see your stress, your anxiety, or anything like that, because you want to keep them comfortable and calm so you get the most information from the interview. And you should always record your interview. You must record your interview because, number one, you're going to listen to that recording a couple times to get a sense of what's going on and how the participant is sounding in their interviews. But you're also going to want to transcribe the interview, and the only way to accurately transcribe an interview is to have a recorded record of it. I highly recommend getting a small digital recorder. They're inexpensive, and it would allow you to record phone calls. It will allow you to record interviews. It will allow you to record a Zoom meeting, for example, if you can't get the Zoom to record. Part of the situation is if you're going to send it out to be transcribed by an outside service, they're going to want to get a digital file. So sometimes recording a Zoom call may not actually give them a file that they can use because they need to be able to slow down or speed up the rate of speaking to match their rate of typing. Here's some more tips. You want to make sure that you're interactive and sensitive to the language being used by the interviewee. If they use a certain word to describe a certain activity, you need to use that word as well and not try to correct them or try to use the word that you know for it. Now, that being the case, if you're doing, for example, a phenomenological, you want them to define words you don't know. And then you may ask them the difference between the word you know and the word they know. So if for example, in tennis there's a backhand, and when you're interviewing a tennis player, they tell you about a reverse jab, you'll want to know what a reverse jab is. And then, if they describe it very similar to what you know as a backhand, then you say, well, how is the reverse jab different than a backhand? Now, that will get you more information from the participant's point of view because they can now compare the two things together. You want to try to keep the agenda flexible. If it goes a little long, it may go a little long. If it goes a little short, it may go a little short. It's a live moment situation. You want to be sure to go below the surface of what you're trying to find out about. You want to know what people think and feel in a deeper level. And you want to know what they say in as much detail as they can provide. Again, this is rich data, so you want to make sure that you're getting all of it that you can. Again, check to make sure you understand what the respondent means when they say something, especially if it seems confusing to you. You can also follow up on interviewees and ask them to clarify something as you transcribe or as you look at it more and realize you don't understand it. Don't oppose your own structures and assumptions. Again, this is bias. And you need to consider how you're perceived by the interviewee. The characteristics such as class, race, sex, and social distance affect the interview. A white man interviewing a black woman is going to have a different context than a black woman interviewing a white man and a black woman interviewing a black man. People from different classes, such as a perceived lower class social class, interviewing someone of a perceived upper class. So, for example, if you are dressed in a flannel shirt and shorts when you go to interview a CEO of a company, that CEO may look down on you and not really feel like telling you any information because they see you as being less class. Of course, men sometimes intimidate women, and so therefore sometimes it's hard for a man to interview a woman about a sensitive subject because the woman perceives the man as being too much or too controlling or too masculine to discuss a sensitive topic with. So you have to think about all of these things when you're considering your interviewing, because it is a personal thing to interview someone. You're going to want to develop an interview guide. The World Health Organization has some steps here. You want to make sure you identify the appropriate topics and questions. You want to make sure that your questions will answer the research questions that you have. So you want to make sure that your research questions are covered under your interview questions. Research questions are broad. Interview questions are specific. So you want to make sure the specific questions you're asking are going to answer those research questions. You don't want to get to the end of your study and find out that you don't have any data to actually answer one of your important questions. You want to decide on the level of detail, draft the questions, put them in the order you want, list any probes or prompts. So if you anticipate that someone's going to answer something in a certain way, you may want to have a probe already written to give you more detailed information. Another thing that's not on this list, but you want to make sure that your questions are not in any way that can be answered yes or no or with a short answer, because people will often go the short answer route whenever possible. And then you have to pilot your questions. You need to get somebody who identifies with the problems or somebody that has experienced this before and ask them the questions. You can also get a spouse or a friend and ask them questions as well, just to make sure the language is clear for somebody who may not be in the field. Often in the field of K-12 education, there are many acronyms, and teachers tend to have a second language where they use with each other. But if you're interviewing, say, administrators or other people like parents, they may not have that same level of understanding. So you want to make sure it's clear for everyone that you're going to be interviewing. Questions to avoid during interviews. You don't want to do long questions. You want the question to be short and to the point, and to that end, you don't want to do double-barreled or multiple-barreled questions. What do you feel about the current video game content compared to that of 5 years ago? You're asking a comparison of two things, games 5 years ago and games currently. Now, that comparison could give you vital data, but you can do that comparison on your own if you just ask them, how do you feel about current video games? And then you ask them, how do you feel about video games that came out 5 years ago? By asking them two separate questions, you can go to a deeper level of detail, and then you can compare and contrast them yourself. If you're going to ask a double-barreled question like this, or a comparison question, you may want to ask it after you've asked each individual part of it, then come to a third question where you ask them to compare themselves. Again, leave out as much jargon as possible. Don't use acronyms and things in your questions. Try to say the whole thing out just in case someone doesn't have the same understanding that you do. Don't ask leading questions. This is where your bias comes in. You know, why do you like the concept of welfare reform? Well, we don't know they do like the concept of welfare reform. You may think everyone does, but some people may not, and you can't assume that. And you're leading them by forcing them to say, oh yes, I agree with that. So again, you don't want to bias your questions, and you want to keep your language neutral as well. You don't want to make sure that you want to be very careful to make sure your views are not coming out, that your biases are not coming out. It's very difficult to do, but if you share your interview questions with your peers, with your committee, with your chair, with anyone that isn't responsible for helping you with this process, then you will be able to make sure that you can address any bias that you might have. When you're asking questions and during a qualitative interview, you want to make sure that you gather a lot of different types of data, not just a description of what they think happened or what they believe is happening, but also the behaviors they see, any opinions they have, beliefs, how does it connect to their core beliefs? What are their feelings on this subject? What is their knowledge of the subject? Give me some sensory descriptions. How did it make you feel? Or what was happening in that moment? How did it feel when that person was talking to you? And then you always want to collect background and demographic information as part of your interviewing. And this will help you later on if you're finding differences based on some kind of demographic information. You'll be able to collect that data. It's also important to show that you're interviewing a representative sample of the group that you're interviewing. For example, if you're interviewing teachers tend to predominantly be women. I believe the last number I saw was 75 to 80% of teachers are women. You don't want to be interviewing 10 men out of the 10 people you're going to interview unless your subject is to see how men are experiencing something related to teaching. But if your subject is about general teaching and you are interviewing 10 people and 80% of the typical teachers are women, then you want at least 8 of your participants to be women. That way you're representing the group properly. It's also important that you want to make sure you maintain control of the interview. You want to know what you're trying to find out, and you want to make sure the questions get you that information. You also want to make sure that the participant doesn't go off track too far. It's okay to let the participant go off track a little bit, but eventually you're going to have to guide them back on track because they will tend to want to go wax poetically about something or complain about something or, just vent their feelings. It's okay to let them vent a little bit, but then you have to get them back to the topic. You also want to make sure that you give appropriate verbal and nonverbal feedback to let them know you're listening. Just be a good listener. So say, okay, I heard that. And maybe even repeat back to them what they said to make sure you understood it properly. Good feedback versus bad feedback. The concept of this is that you don't want to be berating an interviewee saying, that question your answer was too short. Can you not give me a bigger answer? Instead, you would give them good feedback like, oh, could you tell me a little bit more about that? Could you expand on this idea a little bit? That's the difference between good and bad feedback. And then avoid bias wherever possible. And again, controlling your biases is probably the largest challenge. In qualitative research, we understand that bias exists, and we know that the interviewer is going to be biased to some degree. Especially if you're interested in your topic, because your interest shows that you know about your topic and you will have biases built in about what you like or what you don't like. So you want to list the characteristics that might bias you. What could be your biases? Are you biased because you're a man? Are you biased because you are an expert in that field? Are you biased because you have been teaching for 20 years and you know about teaching? You want to write all that down, anything that could be a bias for you. Then what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have, so once you have written out all your biases, then you want to write down how you might counteract these biases. What ways will you be vigilant during your interviewing to make sure that you don't let those biases actually get involved in the interview? And then make sure that you then double check. Make sure that you're counteracting your biases don't actually lead to other biases themselves. Trying to seem too neutral about a topic could actually make yourself seem uncaring or unresponsive to someone. So make sure that you consider that side of the coin as well. Okay, the next research instrument I'm going to talk about is focus groups. Focus groups are when you are interviewing a group of people, and the idea is to get input from several different people about a certain topic. So within a focus group, the extra thing you're getting is the interaction of the participants with each other. That is an extra layer of data that you're getting. So for example, you may have a focus group. Let's just make it easy. Let's say you're having a focus group about a product like eggs. And you're asking these people, well, what do you think about eggs? What do you think about this brand of eggs? And somebody could give an answer. And then when they do, that could spark someone else in the group to say, oh, I feel the same way, but also, did you consider this? And then the person who was giving the original answer could say, oh, no, I didn't. But now that you said that, I think it's a great idea. So it helps the participants to give support for each other. And it can also help them with their recollections of events. So a focus group is a carefully planned discussion to obtain the perceptions of a defined interest area. It needs to be held in a permissive, non-threatening environment. It typically is 7 to 10 people, but you can have a focus group as small as with just 3 people, should you want to. The main thing to consider here is that the people that you recruit have common characteristics. They need to have common, basically, experiences around the problem that you want to look at. If they've never experienced the problem, then they wouldn't be related to the actual topic that you're looking at. And then you want to make sure that the focus group has a trained interviewer, moderator, or facilitator. If that's you as the researcher, then just make sure that you've read up on running a focus group, because it is different than doing a one-on-one interview. Focus groups are much harder to keep on task, so you want to make sure that you're doing that. And usually people do a set of 3 focus groups for a study. Basically, to gather the information you need, you want to get the opinions of as many people as possible. And this is kind of a group sync, so it really represents the opinions of one group. So getting the opinions of other groups to go along with that is good. So why would anyone do a focus group? Well, you want to collect qualitative data, of course. You want to determine the feelings, perceptions of a group of people related to a service, a program, an opportunity, and you want to get their attitudes. But also you want to get their attitudes while they're interacting with other people. It's typically done in a consumer angle, where people are reviewing a product or trying a new product for the first time, or watching a movie for the first time, and then the focus groups give their opinions. It's important to understand when you're doing a qualitative research for a social research for a problem, that you're going to want to make sure that you are getting participants who aren't going to hijack your group by being one extreme or another. Because often someone will talk over other people. So as the facilitator, you have to be sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen, that people aren't talking over other people. Focus groups are effective when people have something to share, therefore they're motivated to be a part of the group. And the goal is to understand human behavior, not to just collect a whole bunch of complaints or something like that. Focus groups are not effective when they are divided within or angry within the group. The goal is not to obtain an objective insight, but to prove your point. And the organization is just trying to improve its image. In other words, they just want to get a whole bunch of people to come in and say how great they are. When you're selecting participants, is similar to selecting participants for a interview. Same set of rules, same selection apply. But you do want to make sure that when you're selecting a group, that the group itself is representative of the issue that you're trying to solve. And be careful when you're selecting that pool that you make sure that there's no bias that going into that selection process. Ultimately, you want to make sure you have a pool of many participants that you can then randomly select. So if you were to say have 30 participants and you randomly select 10 to be in group 1, 10 to be in group 2, and 10 to be in group 3, then you have your 3 constructed groups. Typically, focus groups are somewhat incentivized. Usually there's snacks or gifts or money involved because people are giving their time to come to the group. It doesn't have to be, but you do want to make sure you declare that on your IRB if you do that. Notification processes, again, this is important for people to show up on time, to all be there. If people are late or if people don't come, it can throw the group dynamic off. So you want to make sure you have plenty of reminders that go out just to remind people to show up on the day they're supposed to be there. As the moderator, you want to make sure that you're mentally prepared, that you find a location that's going to be neutral, that's going to let enough people sit around and talk, but also you have to think about, are you going to be able to record them? So the room has to be small enough that all people's voices can be heard. It might be hard to do a focus group in, like, say, a classroom where you're sitting at the front of the class and have your recorder in front of you and then the group is behind you. So that could become problematic. You want to make sure you record the discussion. that you want to have some small talk or ice-breaking exercises to be ready for, like, say, if people are going to be a few minutes late, etc., etc. Make sure you have a good introduction and that you are being upbeat. When you have kind of a snappy introduction or you're upbeat in the beginning, it does help to make the participants at ease. Throughout the focus group, you want to make sure you pause to make sure everyone has time to speak and that you probe when appropriately. And the subtle group control basically means make sure that one person isn't talking more than another, make sure that someone isn't intimidating someone. If you have a person that has an answer for every question and wants to speak first, you may say one of the probes like, I'd like to hear from someone else on this one, or so-and-so, could you give me your opinion on this? And again, control reactions to the participants. So make sure that they don't get overwhelmed or they don't, go off on some rant. It is good to have a moderator that is not you. So that's someone that's asking the questions, someone that's kind of running the group while you as the researcher are observing and listening and taking notes. So it's good to have a moderator or an assistant moderator to help you as well to keep the group in control, to lead questions in the right direction. And then, of course, you want to have a good conclusion and wrap up just to make the people feel like that you heard them and you understand, and then, keep them in the loop eventually by letting them know the results that you have found. In the beginning of the focus group is where you set the tone, is where you put the ground rules out. So you want to make sure you have a good welcome, a good overview. They'll probably have to sign their consent forms. You have the ground rules, and then you go get to your first question once those have all been set. Make sure your questions are open-ended, just like with an interview. Avoid dichotomous questions, which are yes-no answers. You really ask why, because that's asking for a judgment. So it's better to just ask grounded questions like what happened, how did it happen, that kind of thing, than like say why did it happen, because then they're having to basically give testimony about someone else's or the organization's thoughts or feelings on a subject. Use think back questions, which means think back to the day that you first started at this organization, blah, blah, blah. And you want to make sure that, again, when you're preparing your questions, you are thinking about bias and you're thinking about your topic and making sure that the questions will answer those issues. And then you're going to want to be analytical as the process is going on. You definitely will be taking notes while you're in the group. While people are talking, you'll be taking notes. Immediately after the focus group, you want to take more notes, collect your thoughts, think about the themes that you saw. Within hours after the focus group, you want to make sure that you are listening to the recording, that you are trying to remind yourself about what happened and taking more notes. And then days later, you will analyze the focus group and then go through the whole series. Oh, sorry, I skipped over. Focus group analysis tip. Focusing on a focus group day to consider the words, the context, the internal consistency, the frequency of and extensiveness of the comments. Like, did the group really go after one question and have a ton of stuff to say, and then another question they didn't? Compare those things together. How upset or how reactive did people get? What was the intensity? How specific were they? Were they very detailed responses, or was it very vague? Look for the themes. Look for the big ideas in that focus group. Okay, now we're moving a little bit away from qualitative and moving into a little bit more quantitative. We're going to talk about questionnaires. So, questionnaires. What are questionnaires? This is where we get into the world where it can become confusing, because you have interview questions, you have interview guides, you have focus group guides, you have surveys, and you have questionnaires. Oftentimes people think of a survey as a questionnaire, or they think of an interview guide as a questionnaire, because you are asking questions. But there is really a subtle difference between them, and I wanted to kind of point that out, because a lot of people think questionnaires are an appropriate word to use to describe a survey research method or an interviewing. And in qualitative research, you're not going to really use questionnaires. It's possible to ask open-ended questions on a questionnaire. Often you will see some researchers sending out emails with a bunch of questions that they want someone to fill out and email back to them. These ways of collecting data do collect data, but the data is not as deep and rich as doing an interview. In the qualitative field, questionnaires are sometimes used as a pilot study to get some information before they do the main study, or as a follow-up on the main study in order to get more information about what was discussed during the main study. A questionnaire might go out to just kind of gather a little bit more info. So what is a questionnaire? It's an indirect method of research used to gather a wide range of information from a large population. Questionnaires are designed so that participants must read the questions and then they must answer them in some style. The types of questions that are asked in a questionnaire tend to be looking at something that can be answered quickly or in a certain way. So there's a contingency question, which only applies if people answer another question in one way. So if someone says yes to the answer to a question, they go on to the next section. If they say no, they may move to another section. This branched method of questionnaires are used for online survey questionnaires, where you're collecting data from a certain group, and if that group isn't the group if someone isn't a member of that group, they select themselves out of the survey. Matrix is a series of questions that share answer choices. So you may have the same set of answers for a bunch of different questions. So you have a kind of a grid response. Scaled responses, which responses are on a continuum. Now, it's important to understand that Likert scale questions, where you answer on a scale of 1 to 5 a series of questions, those can be statistically analyzed because they're very specific. But scaled responses are not as specific. So you may say, how much on a scale of 1 to 10 do you feel that you represent a good example of this thing? So someone might say an 8, or they might say a 5. Depends on what the person feels like the scale means and everything. So it's a little bit more open-ended than a Likert scale, which is much more common, where you have things like exceeds or below, and common words that people really kind of have a grasp on how they should use them. You also have open-ended questions. Like open-ended questions are questions where the respondent can write their own answer. So these are usually short answer, or they could be essay-sized answers depending on the question you're asking. They tend to be unstructured. They want to generate longer responses, like what do you do on your spare time? It could also be based on word association or completion. So finish the story, or describe this picture that I'm showing you, or one of the hardest tasks on your job is, and then describe that task in more detail. These open-ended questions are letting the person answer in any way that they choose. Again, when you have a short answer like this last one, what is the hardest task to do on your job? This could be answered in many, many different ways. The answers to this questionnaire, especially to this one sentence, can be used later to develop a survey, which can then be statistically analyzed once you have the common list of tasks that someone does on the job you're studying. And then you have closed-ended questions. These are questions that are dichotomous, like yes-no questions or multiple choice questions. Again, you can analyze closed-ended questions statistically. Yes or no becomes a 0 or a 1. True or false is 0 or 1. But in the type that you would do in a questionnaire, you're getting more of a descriptive kind of data instead of a numeric data that you would really want to statistically analyze. But you could, because if there's a set of answers, you can assign numbers to those. Those numbers can be analyzed. So if there's not a set list of answers, then it's too open-ended to analyze statistically. There are subjective versus objective questions. Objective questions cannot be influenced by personal preferences or beliefs. Are you an MIS major? Do you go to the University of Kentucky? These questions are objective. They're yes or no. They're fill in the blank kind of questions. Subjective questions are questions that are influenced on personal preferences and beliefs. A questionnaire is more likely to have subjective questions. A survey would have more objective questions. The idea behind the subjective question is that you're trying to collect, in a sense, qualitative data about something, but you're doing it on a large number of people, so therefore you go to the questionnaire format where you're not going to get as much depth, but you're going to get breadth, so you're going to get a large number of answers. And as I said, a questionnaire can be qualitative or quantitative, but it is typically quantitative. They're typically looking at short answers or things that can be, put into numbers. However, the open nature of the answers, especially if you do open-ended questions, does move towards the qualitative part of the spectrum. Typically, you see a questionnaire used when you're doing some type of mixed method study where you want to collect some quantitative data that is numeric, yes/no questions, that kind of thing. And then you want to collect some qualitative data as well by using some open-ended questions. You'll see this often where a survey will be sent out or a questionnaire. Really, honestly, you can use those interchangeably, but the way that I see it is a questionnaire will have open-ended questions on it, whereas a survey will not. But they are often used interchangeably, but the truth is that it really, you don't see typically surveys that have open-ended questions, and you typically don't see questionnaires that are mostly closed-ended or all closed-ended. So in this situation, you'll have your closed-ended questions, and then after that, you'll have open-ended questions to collect more data. So if you answered X above, tell me more about that, that kind of thing. A majority of research, qualitative data is preferred because it provides more accurate answers than quantitative, but that's not really true as much as it provides more descriptive answers. I think that would be a better word. Questionnaire tips: try to make your questions clear as possible, not heavily based on interpretation. Wording of the questions is important so that you get the most precise answers, because remember, you won't be there to ask follow-ups or probing questions. Avoid similar response choices, so you shouldn't have the same question asked in different ways about the same topic. Try to get one and done. Do not include questions that will provide data that isn't related to your goals, and add open-ended questions to get the participants to further express their opinions. And again, this is where a matrix or a branching survey can really be helpful, because you can ask them some closed-ended questions and then their answers could lead you to another section where you ask them their open-ended questions. And now to the final part of this wonderful discussion, we're going to talk about surveys. And as I said, surveys are a instrument that is used in quantitative research. You will typically not use a survey in qualitative research. Again, if they're using an open-ended question survey in a qualitative study, then it's most likely they're actually using a questionnaire, and they just use the word survey because, again, they are used interchangeably, even though that's really not the best. So survey research is the most common method used in social sciences, as well as a bunch of different other fields. The reason that they say survey research is used commonly in social sciences is because you're really getting someone's responses about the way they think or feel about something that happened. It's not as numeric as asking them to, give you their blood pressure or their heart rate or any kind of numbered data. This is more about, tell me what you think about this, or on a scale of 1 to 10, that kind of question. You conduct survey research to gather data that's not available from other sources. You want to be as unbiased as possible. However, surveys can be written in a biased way. Even the questions you ask on a survey can bias people to think or want to answer in a certain way. So it's not that surveys are completely unbiased, but you want it to be as unbiased as you can, and having it written so that you don't read the question, where, you can use your tone to influence someone. So if I'm going to ask, say, the question, do you like chocolate? I could say it as, do you like chocolate? Or I could say it as, do you like chocolate? and that could influence the way that people answer. A survey, questionnaire to that matter, is written, so it tends to have a little bit more, less tonality, less layered way of answering the questions. You also, in a survey, you get consistency of measurement, so you're asking the same things on a scale of 1 to 5, or you could ask a question like, what income bracket are you? And you give them 5 income bracket choices that do not overlap. And that will get you a certain area that you can then say you can apply numbers to and then statistically analyze. The purpose of a survey is to measure certain attitudes or behaviors in a population. And from that population, typically you're going to choose a sample. Survey research is typically done over large groups, but the goal is to sample a part of that population in order to get the answer to your information. Surveys want to collect information from as many individuals as possible, hoping that they can understand the whole population better. Survey research is, as I said, primarily quantitative, but qualitative methods can be used. But again, it's typically not. Typically, the information collected in a survey is quantitative information. And if you add qualitative, then you're typically moving into the questionnaire range. Now, there are times when you can actually survey an entire population. But for most of the time, the population is too large, so researchers get a sample. Sample is representative based on the group that you're trying to survey. If you're going to survey the United States, for example, you want to make sure that you're covering the percentages of male and female. You want to make sure you're covering the racial separations. You want to make sure you factor in cultural situations, East Coast, West Coast, geographic information. And make sure that then the sample that you pick is representative as much as possible of that main population so that you can then get good answers that can be generalized up to the main population. Survey research classifications. Basically, surveys are classified on their purpose. An exploratory survey is used to form general ideas about research questions. So you're exploring the general ideas. Descriptive surveys collect more specific descriptions of the variables of interest. So you're trying to learn more about what those variables mean to the population. An explanatory survey is used to develop an understanding of relationship among variables of interest. So again, explanatory survey would be the typical way that you would do a normal survey that you are collecting data for a quantitative study. Surveys can also be classified according to time. A cross-sectional survey is used to collect data at one point in time from a sample used to represent a larger population. Longitudinal surveys, however, are used to collect data over time. They can look at trends, they can look at cohorts of people, or they can look at panels and then sample panel of respondents at different times. Survey research begins with identifying the problem, having a research question. Typically, you'll have hypotheses as well. In higher education, a good example of this is freshman enrollments are down. What do college-bound high school students think of us? That could be a survey question or a research question, and then you would get some survey questions to find out the answer to that. When you conduct a survey, it's important that you understand that survey construction has to follow certain guidelines in order to be valid. So you need to plan for your survey. You need to sample. Who are you going to sample? What are the people you're going to pick? You need to construct your survey. You need to test it. Make sure you pilot the survey with people so that you can make sure your language is correct, the words you're asking are correct. You follow up the pilot by interviewing the people that you piloted with. So you ask them, when you responded to this question, what did you think? When on a question of scale of 1 to 5, what did you feel 5 represented? You get an understanding of are you actually collecting the data that you want to collect with your survey. Then you send your survey out. The data is collected, that's translated, which basically means that yes, no becomes 0, 1. Anything that can be converted to a number that can be statistically analyzed then would be converted into numbers because statistics uses numbers. You would then conduct your analysis, conclusions, and reporting. Now, with a survey, the idea is that you want to answer your research question or your hypothesis by collecting the data that you need to answer that question. You need to think of the population, their literacy, their language issues, accessibility. You want to make sure that your sampling is representative of the population. Questions, you want to make sure that you're considering the type, the length, complexity. Is there an existing survey already that you could use in this situation? And that's one note I wanted to make here, is that in quantitative research, testing of your instrument is very important. If you can find an instrument that has already been tested and shown to be valid, then you don't have to actually create your own instrument. You can reuse that instrument with permission, of course. This is the case of a lot of times someone wants to do a leadership study. So they use some kind of leadership instrument that is a set of questions that has already been tested to provide responses about the level of leadership or the type of leadership that someone is doing. You want to make sure you're checking your bias and that your questions aren't biased. And then think about, how are you going to administer this? Surveys need to be administered in a way that they can get to the most people. And so you want to make sure that you have cost, time, and equipment covered. Surveys aren't always as easy as you send out a survey to 1,000 people and all 1,000 respond. Sometimes people just ignore it. Maybe it goes to spam. They don't want to participate. So you may end up getting an initial sample of 300, which means you're going to have to address another sample to get more data. You may see that your sample is becoming unbiased, so only men are answering the survey and women are not. Why is that happening? What is it about the survey that's causing women not to answer it? You need to figure that out and address that. And again, there are other kinds of tests and measurement tools out there. I kind of lump all these together into quantitative surveys type instruments. But you want to, when you're looking for an instrument, a survey or whatever, a test, you want to make sure that you understand the type, what it measures, and how reliable and valid it is. And then you want to think about how the scores are calculated. So in some tests, like Myers-Briggs, for example, or other tests, there are certain ways that the scores are calculated. You know, you can't always assume that the scores, like for example, sometimes they switch from the Likert scale from a 1 to 5 to a 5 to 1 in order to make sure that people are answering in an unbiased way. They mix up the questions. So you have to be sure that you know how to unmix the things to get the correct data. You need to know what processes are needed to use the instrument. Is there any adjustments that you have to make based on your study? You need to get permission to use that instrument. You want to think about how the data will be collected, analyzed, and you need to consider a pilot study. I really feel that a pilot study is important because you want to make sure you're actually collecting the data in a way that is not offensive. And an example of this is from my dissertation research. I wanted to interview people who live in residence halls who are resident directors. Well, in the field, they have different names for what residence halls are. They don't want you to call them dorms, for example. If you call them a dorm, they get very offended by that. So there were certain words that I learned during my pilot study that I could not use or should not use, including descriptions of jobs and things like that. It was very important to help me then develop my my interview questionnaire guide. General rules: if there's an existing tool, use it. If it fits. Don't force it to fit. You may be able to alter it slightly to get to make it fit your survey group better. Just remember that existing tools that have been validated through previous research, by altering them too much, you're invalidating that testing. You also want to make sure that you, in your literature review, understand the tool, where it came from, and how it works. That way, you can make sure that the tool is the tool that you need to use for your quantitative data collection. And then, as always, with any methodology, you want to make sure that you provide enough information for the study to be replicated. And in a case of you're using a tool, if you alter that tool, you want to make sure that you say exactly how you altered it. That way, if people are out there in the field, they will have the information about what you did to change the tool, and they may then want to do that themselves. Okay, so this was a lecture, not as much as a webinar as planned, but if you do have questions, you're welcome to email me. Dr. Presley Rankin, rankinp@cityuniversity.edu, and I will be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you for attending this webinar.